The day Hazel Barrett rode into Coldwater Creek with nothing but a saddlebag, a surveyor's map, and the kind of quiet fury that only comes from being lied to by a dead man, the whole town stopped what it was doing and stared. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was just beginning to shake off the last grip of a brutal winter that had killed more cattle than anyone wanted to count. The land stretched out in every direction like a promise that hadn't decided yet whether it intended to keep itself. All pale gold grass and wide blue sky, and the occasional dark smear of a storm gathering on the horizon. Coldwater Creek was not much of a town, a general store, a livery stable, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse when Judge Harmon rode through, a post office that was really just a shelf inside the general store, and a scattering of homes built by people stubborn enough to believe this particular patch of earth was worth staying on. Hazel Barrett was 26 years old, and she had learned in the last 3 weeks that her father, God rest his manipulative soul, had left her something extraordinary in his will. He had left her land. Not the family home in Abilene, not the money she had half expected and half dreaded receiving, but a deed to 480 acres of raw Texas ground that bordered a property called the Collier Ranch, along the south fork of a river the locals called the Sweetwater Bend. She had also learned, from the lawyer who read the will with the particular discomfort of a man who knows he is delivering complicated news, that the land came with a condition. Her father had made an arrangement, informal but apparently well understood by all parties except Hazel herself, that the land would pass to her only if she settled it within 1 year. If she did not build a dwelling and establish working use of the property within 12 months of the reading of the will, the land would revert to a neighboring claim that her father had already sold the rights to a sale that had never been properly finalized because the original purchase was disputed. It was, in short, a mess. And Hazel, who had spent the last several years keeping books for a dry goods merchant in Abilene and sleeping in a small room above his shop, had decided that a mess was still better than nothing. She arrived in Coldwater Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, and the first person she needed to find was the man whose property adjoined hers. She had his name written in her father's handwriting at the bottom of a letter she had found tucked inside the deed envelope. Roy Collier. The letter said only that Roy Collier was a fair man who knew the land, and that if Hazel ever came to claim her inheritance, she should speak to him first. She found the livery stable keeper, a stout man named Gus Pemberton with enormous side whiskers and kind eyes, and asked him where she might find Roy Collier. Gus looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the saddlebag on her horse, then looked back at her face with an expression she could not entirely read. "Roy Collier," he said, "is not an easy man to find if he doesn't want to be found. But if you ride north on the main road about 4 miles, turn left at the Twin Cottonwoods and follow that track until you hit the fence line with the brand mark burned into every third post, you'll be on his land. Whether he'll talk to you once you're there is a different matter." "Why wouldn't he talk to me?" Hazel asked. Gus scratched the back of his neck. "Roy had a hard couple of years, truth be told. Lost his wife 2 winters back. Lost a good portion of his herd last winter to the cold. He's not unfriendly, but he's quiet, keeps to himself." Hazel thanked him, paid for her horse to be watered and rested, and asked if there was a place in town she could rent a room for a few nights. There was. A widow named Mrs. Dunlap rented out a room in her house that was clean and had a window that faced east, which Hazel decided was a good sign. She left her saddlebag there, ate a bowl of beans at the saloon that turned out to be surprisingly good, and slept a full 8 hours for the first time since the lawyer had read her father's will. In the morning, she rode north. The land was beautiful in a way that surprised her. She had grown up moving from town to town with her father, who had a talent for acquiring things and a limited talent for keeping them, and she had never spent much time in open country like this. The sky was enormous. The grass moved in waves when the wind came through, and there were hawks turning slow circles overhead, and the air smelled like dirt and cedar, and something she could not name that felt, unreasonably, like freedom. She found the twin cottonwoods and turned left. She found the fence posts with the brand burned into them, a simple C, nothing elaborate, and followed the track as it rose gently toward a low ridge. On the other side of the ridge, she saw the ranch. It was not what she had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. It was a solid, working ranch, well built and well maintained in the way that spoke not of wealth but of someone who cared about what he was doing. There was a main house built of stone and timber, low and long with a wide porch. There were 2 barns, both in good repair. There were corrals with horses in them, good horses she could see even from a distance, and a smaller building that was probably a bunkhouse. There was smoke coming from the chimney of the main house, thin and white in the morning air. A man was working at the fence of the near corral. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, wearing a faded blue shirt and a hat that had seen better days. He had his back to her as she rode up, and he was mending a section of fence with the focused, economical movements of someone who has done the same task so many times it has become something close to meditation. "Mr. Collier," Hazel said, pulling her horse up at a respectful distance. He turned, and she saw, for the first time, the face of Roy Collier. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes the particular dark brown of creek water in deep shade. He was not handsome in any conventional way. His nose had been broken at some point and not set quite right, and there was a scar along his left jawline that she would later learn came from a piece of flying wire during a fence repair gone wrong. But he had a face that was hard to look away from, serious and steady, with something behind the eyes that she could only describe as depth. Like there was more going on beneath the surface than was currently visible. He looked at her without expression for a moment. Then he said, "You're Henry Barrett's daughter." It was not a question. "I am," she said. "Hazel Barrett. I've come about the land." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of resignation, as if he had been expecting this and had been hoping he was wrong. "Get down off your horse," he said. "I'll put some coffee on." The kitchen of the main house was clean and sparse. There was a table, 4 chairs, a cast iron stove, a shelf of tin mugs and plates, and a single window above the dry sink that looked out over the south pasture. There were no curtains. There were no decorations of any kind except a small painting of mountains, not Texas mountains, she thought, but somewhere with real height and snow, that hung beside the door to the back hallway. It was a good painting, careful and detailed, and it looked out of place in the severity of the room in a way that made her wonder about it. Roy poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and set one in front of her without asking how she took it. Then he sat down across the table and looked at her with those dark, creek-water eyes. "Your father told me you might come," he said. "Eventually. He told me to speak with you first," she said. "He didn't tell me why." Roy turned his mug in his hands. "Because the situation is complicated. The land he left you, the 480 acres on the east side of the Sweetwater Bend, it's real land with a real deed. But there's a man named Deacon Price who has been claiming for 2 years that your father sold him the water rights to that section before the deed was properly recorded. Price has been using that claim to try to force me out of my grazing easement on the south bank of the river." Hazel set down her mug. "Was my father's sale to Price legitimate?" "I don't know," Roy said. "I know your father was in debt when he died. I know Price is the kind of man who finds people in debt and makes arrangements that benefit himself more than the other party. And I know that if Price secures the water rights to that section, it will cut off access to the only reliable water source on my south range, which means I lose about 1/3 of my grazing land." Hazel was quiet for a moment, processing this. "So my inheriting the land is better for you than Price getting it?" "Yes," Roy said. He was not a man who complicated things with unnecessary softness. "And what does my father's condition say, exactly? That I have to settle the land within a year?" "That is what the deed condition says. You have to establish a dwelling and demonstrate working use of the property. And if I do that, Hazel said slowly, Price's claim on the water rights becomes secondary to the deed because I'm the active title holder. Roy looked at her for a moment with something that might have been surprise, though it was so briefly present she wasn't sure she had seen it correctly. "You're quick," he said. "I kept books for 6 years," she said. "I understand how paper works." "Then you understand your situation. You have 480 acres of good land that borders the best water source in this part of the county. You have a year to settle it. You have no money, no materials, no hands, and no experience working land." "I have the deed," she said. "Yes," he said, "you have the deed." They looked at each other across the table. "I need help," Hazel said. It was not easy for her to say. She was aware of exactly how much it cost her. "I can't do this alone." "No," Roy agreed, "you can't." "Would you be willing to help me? I can offer," she thought rapidly, "labor. I can work. I'm not afraid of hard work. And I can keep your accounts. I saw your books when I came through the door. If those are your actual financial records, you need someone to put them in order." Roy followed her gaze to the stack of papers on the shelf beside the stove, which did indeed look as if they had been organized by someone throwing them into the air and seeing where they landed. "I need more than an account keeper," he said. "And I am not in the habit of taking on people who don't know what they're doing." "Then teach me," Hazel said. A long pause, the stove ticked. Outside, one of the horses made a sound. "There is another option," Roy said. He said it carefully in the tone of a man who has considered something for a long time and is not entirely comfortable with the conclusion. "Your father mentioned it in his letter to me. He thought it might make things simpler." "What option?" Roy looked at her directly. "He suggested that if you came, I should offer to marry you." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Hazel looked at Roy Collier, this stranger with broken-nosed steadiness and dark, careful eyes, sitting across a table in his sparse kitchen on the edge of a Texas prairie, and she thought about all the ways she had imagined her life going. Marriage had not been entirely absent from those imaginings, but it had never looked like this. "That is a very unusual offer," she said. "I know it," Roy said. "I'm not making it for romantic reasons. I want to be honest with you about that. I'm making it because if we are married, your deed and my deed become a single holding. Price cannot attack either claim without attacking both. And the combined land with the water rights clearly in the name of a settled working couple is unassailable." "And what would I receive from this arrangement?" Hazel asked. "Half my land," Roy said. "If you marry me, I will deed you half of what I own, 4,200 acres divided in half. You would own it fully in your name, not subject to any condition. We would work the ranch together. What is mine is yours." Hazel looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. "Which half?" she asked. Roy blinked. "I beg your pardon. Which half of the land would be mine? I want to know the geography of it before I decide anything." He seemed to have not expected the question. He reached into a drawer and produced a rough map of his property, hand-drawn with the careful detail of a man who knows every inch of his land, and spread it on the table between them. Hazel studied it. She could see the river, the Sweetwater Bend, running along the eastern portion of the property. She could see where her inherited land adjoined his. She could see the pastures, the draws, the rises of ground. "I want the half with the river," she said. Roy Collier looked at her across that map for 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, and then something happened to his face that she would later learn was extraordinary, that his foreman and his 2 ranch hands and every person who knew him would have found astonishing to witness. He laughed. Not a small sound, not a polite chuckle, but a real laugh, sudden and genuine and rusty with disuse, like a gate that has not been opened in a very long time and surprises everyone, including itself, by swinging free. It lasted only a moment. Then he pressed his hand over his mouth as if surprised by himself, and the expression that replaced the laughter was something softer and more unguarded than anything she had yet seen on his face. "The half with the river," he repeated. "It has better grazing, it has the water source, and it is more valuable by any reasonable measure," Hazel said. keeping her voice steady even though something in her was startled and moved by that laugh in a way she had not anticipated. "If we are making a business arrangement, I should have the better half." "You are not wrong," he said, and the corner of his mouth was still curved upward, just slightly, like the ghost of that laugh had decided to linger. "The half with the river. Do we have an agreement?" she asked. Roy looked at her, he looked at the map. He looked at the door and then back at her, and she had the sense that he was thinking about something she could not see, something that lived in the private interior of a man who had been keeping himself to himself for too long. "We have an agreement," he said, "but I should tell you one more thing before you say yes fully." "Tell me." "I am not easy to live with," he said. "I am quiet. I work long days. I have not been good company since my wife died. I'm not sure I remember how to be." Hazel looked at him steadily. "I am not looking for entertainment," she said. "I am looking for a fair partner and a piece of land I can call my own. If you are honest and fair and you keep your word, that is enough." "I keep my word," Roy said. "That is the one thing I can promise you with certainty." "Then that is enough," she said. They were married 6 days later by Pastor Elias Birch in the Coldwater Creek church, which was small and needed paint and had a board missing from one of its pews. The ceremony was attended by Gus Pemberton, Mrs. Dunlap, Roy's foreman, a weathered and decent man named Luther Crane, who was 45 and had been with Roy for 7 years, and 2 of Roy's hands, brothers named Cal and Pete Dawson, who were in their early 20s, and treated the whole affair with the bashful solemnity of young men who are not sure what expression is appropriate. Hazel wore her best dress, which was not the dress you would wear to a wedding if you had a choice in the matter, but was clean and well-fitted, and a deep green that suited the color of her eyes, which were green as river grass in summer. Roy wore his least faded shirt and had both shaved and gotten his hair cut, which she noted with private appreciation. He looked different with his jaw clean, younger somehow and less armored. When Pastor Birch got to the part about "I do" and looked at Roy said it in the quiet, certain way he said most things, looking directly at Hazel without the slight awkwardness she might have expected from a man entering a business arrangement. When it was her turn, she said it the same way, meeting his eyes, keeping her voice even. He put a ring on her finger that she would later learn had been his mother's, a simple gold band worn thin with years, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was that the weight of it was not unpleasant. After the ceremony, they rode back to the ranch together, and they were quiet most of the way, but it was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the quiet of 2 people who are thinking carefully about something important. The deed transfer was completed the following day, with Luther and Cal Dawson as witnesses. Roy had the documents drawn up with the precise language the lawyer in Coldwater Creek recommended, and when Hazel signed her name to the ownership of the eastern half of the Collier ranch, her name, in full, Hazel Barrett Collier, inked into the title, she felt the ground shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the earth and everything to do with the understanding that she had, for the first time in her life, something solid under her feet. Deacon Price arrived 2 weeks after the wedding. He came in the late afternoon on a Tuesday, riding a good horse, and accompanied by 2 men who rode slightly behind him in the way that indicated they were employed, not accompanying. Price himself was perhaps 50, heavyset, with the smooth, red-faced assurance of a man who had found that money and persistence generally got him what he wanted. He wore a decent coat and a hat that cost more than most people in Coldwater Creek made in a month. Hazel was on the porch when he arrived, going over the ranch accounts, which she had spent the first 2 weeks thoroughly reorganizing. She had discovered in the process that Roy was an excellent rancher and a terrible record keeper, that he was owed money by 3 separate buyers who seemed to believe that Roy's general quietness meant he had forgotten about the debt, and that his overall financial situation, while not desperate, was tighter than it should have been for a man with this much land and this many cattle. She had already written 3 letters on his behalf to the delinquent buyers, in a firm, clear hand that she thought conveyed exactly the right amount of polite certainty that the debt would be paid. She had not told Roy she was doing it. She had just done it, because it needed doing. Roy was in the near barn when Price arrived, and he came out at the sound of the horses, wiping his hands on a rag. Luther emerged from around the side of the barn and came to stand just to Roy's left, which Hazel noticed and appreciated as the quiet statement it was meant to be. Price looked at Roy and then looked at Hazel on the porch, and his expression arranged itself into something that was designed to look like friendliness but was not. "Roy Collier," he said, "I heard you got married." "I did," Roy said, "and I hear your new wife has taken title to the Barrett land, the east section, the one her father sold me the water rights to." "My wife has clear title to the east section of this property," Roy said. "The Barrett deed was registered and uncontested before her father entered into any arrangement with you. Any claim you have to water rights on that section will need to go through the county land office, where it will be examined against the deed record." Price's friendly expression did not change in any noticeable way, but his eyes went flat. "Henry Barrett made me a promise. I have a letter." "You have a letter," Roy said. "My wife has a deed." Hazel set down her papers and came down the porch steps. She was aware that Roy glanced at her, just briefly, with something in his expression that might have been either concern or something else she could not yet read. "Mr. Price," she said pleasantly, "I am Hazel Collier. I understand you believe you have a claim on the water rights to the eastern section of this property." "I do believe that," Price said. He looked at her with the faintly condescending attention of a man who is reassessing a situation he thought he understood. "I have been through my father's papers thoroughly," she said. "I have found no record of any sale of water rights. I have found a great deal of evidence that my father borrowed money from various parties in the last 2 years of his life, and was not always precise about what he was promising in exchange for those loans. If you have a letter, I would be interested to see it." "I'm sure you would," Price said. "I would also encourage you to take that letter to the county land office before you take it anywhere else," Hazel said. "Because the deed to this property, recorded and witnessed, supersedes any informal agreement made before the deed was properly registered. That is the law." There was a silence. One of Price's men shifted in his saddle. "You've thought about this," Price said. There was an edge in it now, not quite a threat but the neighbor of one. "I have thought about it carefully," Hazel said. "I would encourage you to do the same." Price looked at Roy. Roy was looking at Price with the particular expression he had when something required his full attention, which was very still and very level, and there was nothing in it that gave Price anything to work with. Price turned his horse and rode away. When he was gone, Luther let out a long breath and said, "Well, that went about as well as it could." Roy turned to look at Hazel. She was already climbing back up the porch steps, picking up her papers. "You were right," Roy said, "about the deed superseding an informal agreement." "I know," she said, sitting back down. "That's why I said it." Roy stood there for a moment at the foot of the porch steps, looking at her, and she had the sense again of that depth behind his eyes, that quality of someone thinking about more than they were saying. "Thank you," he said. It was simply said, and she understood that for him it meant quite a lot. "You are welcome," she said, and went back to the accounts. The days that followed were busy ones, because there was always work on a cattle ranch, and Hazel had made it clear from the first that she intended to understand every aspect of what she had half inherited. Roy, to his credit, was a thorough and patient teacher in the ways that mattered, and he did not treat her ignorance with condescension. He showed her the cattle operation from the ground up, how they managed the range rotation to keep the grass from being overgrazed, how they tracked the herd, how the branding worked, how the horses were trained and categorized, how the water was managed. He was surprised by how fast she learned. She suspected he had expected someone who would need everything explained twice, and she found quiet satisfaction in watching him revise his expectations in real time. She surprised him more with the accounts. Within 3 weeks of their marriage, she had not only reorganized his financial records from the past 4 years, but had created a system going forward that was clear and practical, had recovered the debts owed by the 3 delinquent buyers, all of whom paid within a month of receiving her letters, and had identified 2 places where Roy was consistently overpaying for supplies because he had never taken the time to compare prices from competing sources. She negotiated new terms with a merchant in the next town over, saving the ranch a meaningful amount of money per year. Roy said nothing about any of this directly, but she noticed small things. He started leaving the books on the kitchen table each evening rather than on the chaotic shelf. He had started reading the letters she wrote before they were sent, not to supervise them but because, she thought, he wanted to know what she was saying. He had started, very occasionally, asking her opinion about things, not the accounting but the ranch decisions. Where to graze the cattle in the east section, now that it was properly theirs. Whether the horse he was thinking of buying from a man in Amarillo was worth the asking price. She always gave her opinion directly. He always listened to it carefully, and he did not always agree, but when he disagreed he said so plainly and explained his reasoning, which she respected enormously. They were still, in practice, 2 people who lived in the same house rather than 2 people who were genuinely intimate with each other, but there was a quality to their coexistence that was better than she had expected. He was not cold. He was quiet, as he had warned her, and he kept things close, but he was not cold. He was scrupulously fair. He was unfailingly honest. He made coffee every morning and always made enough for 2, and he always set her mug on the table before she came in from feeding the chickens, which she had taken on as her first autonomous ranch task. He also, she noticed, looked at the painting of the mountains sometimes in the evening when he thought she wasn't watching. He would sit at the table with a cup of coffee and look at it with an expression she could not fully parse, something between grief and something else, something that was not quite hope but lived in the same neighborhood. She did not ask about it yet. She filed it away. The first time she made him laugh again, she had not been trying to. It was 6 weeks after they married, and she had attempted for the first time to help Luther and the Dawson brothers with a cattle sort. The operation involved moving a portion of the herd through a series of gates into different pens, which required knowing which cattle were to go where and being able to move with the herd without either panicking them or being knocked over. Hazel did not know these things. She had been given clear instructions and had understood them perfectly in theory. In practice, a cow of considerable size and terrible judgment had decided to go left instead of right, had gone through the gate she was guarding, and in the process of attempting to redirect it, she had stepped into a puddle of extremely fresh and extremely substantial mud, gone down on one knee, and come up looking as if the prairie itself had tried to claim her. Luther and the Dawson brothers had been heroically silent. Cal Dawson had been visibly shaking with suppressed laughter. Roy, who had been on the other side of the corral, had come around the fence to see what had delayed the sort and found her standing in the middle of the pen, knee-deep in mud, holding her dignity with both hands, glaring at the cow that had caused the situation. The cow looked back at her with the sublime indifference of a cow. Roy looked at Hazel. He looked at the mud. He looked at the cow. And then, for the second time, he laughed. Properly. Fully. It came out of him like something that had been waiting behind a dam, warm and genuine, and a little rough at the edges. And it transformed his face into something she had not seen before, something younger and freer and very, very lovely. She found to her own surprise that she was laughing too, at herself, at the cow, at the mud, at all of it. Luther Crane shook his head and said, "First rule of cattle work. They always know which gate you're guarding," and that set all of them off again. It was a small thing. But that evening at supper, when Roy passed her the bread and their fingers nearly touched over the basket, she was aware of something that had not been present before, a warmth between them, new and tentative, like something that had only just decided it might be safe to grow. Summer came, and with it the long work of the season. There was hay to cut and cure, calves to process, fences to ride, water sources to manage against the increasing heat. Roy worked from before sunup to after sundown most days, and Hazel matched him hour for hour, taking on the tasks she had learned and asking for instruction in the ones she had not. She learned to ride the fence lines. She learned to read the weather coming in from the west. She learned the names and personalities of every horse in the string, and which ones could be trusted and which ones required careful handling. She also learned Roy. Not quickly, not all at once, but in pieces and layers, the way you learn a landscape by traveling it slowly. She learned that he had grown up on this land, that his father had built the first cabin here when Roy was 7 years old, that the stone walls of the main house had been laid by his father's hands, and then extended by Roy's own. She learned that the painting of the mountains had been done by his wife, Clara, who had been a skilled painter and who had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1876, 2 years before Hazel arrived. She learned it not from Roy directly but from Luther, who told her one evening when Roy had ridden out to check the east pasture fence and they were alone at the ranch. He took it hard, Luther said. He was mending tack at the bunkhouse door, and he said it looking down at his work, the way people say difficult things when they want to offer them without making them too large. They were only married 3 years. She came out from Georgia, didn't know anything about ranching either when she arrived, but she was a strong woman and she made a life here. And then she got sick, and the weather was so bad we couldn't get a doctor until it was too late. Hazel was quiet. He's not a man who shows much, Luther continued, but he's not a man who doesn't feel things. I think you know that by now. I know it, Hazel said. He's different since you came, Luther said simply. Better. I don't say that to push you toward anything. I say it because it's true and because you deserve to know it. That evening, when Roy came in from the east pasture, Hazel made supper. She made it properly, with the good beef and the dried herbs she had ordered from the general store and the corn bread she had been practicing until it came out right. Roy washed up and came to the table and sat down and looked at the food and then looked at her. You didn't have to do this, he said. I wanted to, she said, which was true. He ate without saying much, which was his way, but she noticed he ate 2 helpings of everything. And at the end of the meal he sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the darkening sky over the south pasture and said, My wife, Clara, she always put herbs in things. I haven't eaten anything with herbs since she died. Hazel looked at him. He was still looking out the window, but his profile was open, not closed, in the way it sometimes was when he was keeping himself in. I'm sorry about Clara, Hazel said. Luther told me a little. I should have said so before now. Roy was quiet for a moment. I didn't know how to talk about her without it taking up too much room, he said. It doesn't seem fair to bring that into this. It is already in this, Hazel said gently. She is part of this place and part of you. That is not a burden to me. It is just true. He turned and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. It was unguarded in a way that made her chest tighten with something she was not yet naming. You are a remarkable woman, he said. Hazel Barrett Collier. I am a practical woman, she said, because it was easier. Those are not mutually exclusive, Roy said, and the corner of his mouth curved up just slightly. She looked down at her own hands on the table and noticed, with a distant shock of self-awareness, that she was warm all the way through, and that it had nothing to do with the stove. The letter from Deacon Price arrived at the end of July, delivered by a man she did not recognize who rode up to the ranch house and handed it to Roy with the blank look of someone who is delivering a message and not being paid to be involved in its contents. Roy read it at the kitchen table while Hazel organized the week's receipts, and when he set it down his expression was the closed, still one she had learned to read as something requiring serious thought. He's filed a claim with the county land office, Roy said. He's claiming that Henry Barrett verbally promised him the water rights on the east section as collateral for a loan of $700 made in October of 1876. He says he has a witness to the conversation. Hazel set down the receipts. She thought carefully. Who is the witness? He doesn't say, but he's asking the land office to conduct an inquiry before any ruling on the deed title. Can he make that request? Any interested party can request an inquiry, Roy said. "It doesn't mean the land office will find in his favor. But it will cost time and money to respond to, and if the inquiry goes on long enough, it eats into your one-year settlement window." Hazel was quiet for a moment, looking at the document. "He is not wrong that my father borrowed money," she said. "I found 2 promissory notes in my father's papers. Neither of them was to Price, but my father was not careful about documentation." "Do you have those promissory notes?" "I have them." Roy looked at her. "We need to take everything you have from your father's papers to the land office before Price can establish his version of events as the starting point. If we arrive with documentation first, the inquiry begins from our position, not his." "I agree," Hazel said. "I can be ready to ride to the county seat tomorrow morning." "I'll come with you," Roy said. "You don't have to." "It's my land too," he said, "and I want to." The county seat was a town called Harker City, a full day's ride east. They left before dawn the next morning, Roy and Hazel and Luther, who came because neither Roy nor Hazel suggested he shouldn't. They rode in relative silence for the first few hours, the way you do in the dark when the land is still cool and the sky is just beginning to consider light. As the sun came up, Roy pulled his horse alongside hers and they rode together for a while without speaking, and then he said out of nowhere, "I used to ride this road with Clara sometimes, to get supplies." "Tell me about her," Hazel said. She said it simply, the way you ask about something you genuinely want to know. Roy was quiet for a moment and then he began to talk. He told her about Clara, about how she had come from a town in Georgia to answer an advertisement he had placed in a newspaper, the way many women came west, the way it was not unusual or shameful, but was simply the reality of a land where women were few and men were many, and loneliness was a practical problem that needed practical solutions. He told her that Clara had arrived in Coldwater Creek with 2 trunks and a paint box, and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by anything, which had made him like her immediately. He told her that they had taken 2 years to fall in love properly, that it had started as the same kind of practical arrangement as this one, and had become something real and good. He told her about the morning he had found Clara painting the mountains from memory, trying to capture the Rockies as she had seen them once on a trip as a girl, and how the painting had not come out quite right, but had been entirely right in some other sense that he could not explain. He told her about the winter she died, and his voice when he got to that part was quiet and careful, the way you carry something fragile. Hazel listened to all of it and said nothing until he was done. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You asked," he said. "I know. I'm glad I did." He looked at her profile, riding beside him in the early morning light, her green eyes on the road ahead, and he thought something he had not yet been able to articulate, something about how the world had a way of being both completely different from what you expected, and at certain unexpected moments better. The county land office in Harker City occupied a narrow building between a hardware store and a barber shop, and the man who ran it, a clerk named Mr. Amos Cole, was methodical and fair, which was the best you could hope for. Hazel laid out her documentation on his desk with the orderly precision she had developed over years of bookkeeping. The deed, her father's will, the registered transfer of the east section into her name, and subsequently into the joint Collier name, the 2 promissory notes from her father's papers with their stated terms, and a brief, clear written summary she had prepared the night before laying out the timeline of events. Amos Cole read everything carefully. Roy sat in the chair beside Hazel and said almost nothing throughout the meeting, letting her handle it, which she appreciated as a sign of respect. Cole looked up from the documents and said, "Mrs. Collier, this is thorough documentation. The deed supersedes any informal agreement unless Mr. Price can produce a written contract with witnesses. A verbal claim with a single unnamed witness is not sufficient to challenge a properly registered deed under Texas land law. I will write to Mr. Price informing him that his inquiry request has been reviewed and found to lack the documentary support necessary to warrant a formal proceeding." Hazel felt the tension release from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said. Outside the land office in the dusty street of Harker City, Roy put his hand on her arm to stop her for a moment. She turned. He was standing very close, closer than he usually stood, and the afternoon sun was in his face, and he was looking at her with that unguarded expression she was learning to recognize as the real version of him, the one beneath all the quiet and the steadiness. "You handled that better than I could have," he said. "We handled it together," she said. He did not move his hand from her arm. His thumb made a slight movement, the smallest possible acknowledgement, against the fabric of her sleeve. "Hazel," he said, just her name. Not a question, not a statement, just her name said in his low, careful voice as if he were testing the weight of it. She looked up at him and did not look away. "I think," he said slowly, "that this has become something more than a practical arrangement for me. I want to say it plainly because I am not good at saying things that are not plain. But I also do not want to assume Roy," she said, in the same tone he had used her name, just his name stopping him mid-sentence. "Yes," he said, "it has become something more than a practical arrangement for me as well," she said. "I have been aware of it for several weeks, and I have not said anything because I was not sure it was the right time." He looked at her steadily. "Is now the right time?" "I think it might be," she said. He lifted his hand from her arm and very slowly, very carefully, as if asking a question with the gesture, took her hand instead. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and her hand fit into it in a way that she had not predicted and could not have reasoned her way into. She looked down at their joined hands, and then up at his face, and she thought she had never seen a person look so simultaneously terrified and certain. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "I know we are already married. I know that is backward, but I would like to do it anyway." She laughed, soft and surprised. "You would like to court your own wife?" "I would," he said, "if she's willing." "She's willing," Hazel said. They rode home in the late afternoon, the three of them, and Luther rode ahead for most of the return journey with the particular tact of a man who understood exactly what he was doing by not riding alongside them. And Roy and Hazel rode side by side in the fading gold light, and talked in a way they had not quite talked before, openly and without the careful navigation of two people in a new arrangement, just two people who were beginning to know each other and finding the process unexpectedly wonderful. He told her more about growing up on the land. She told him about her years in Abilene, the quietness of the life she had been living, the strange mix of competence and confinement she had felt, the way her father's will had felt simultaneously like an insult and a lifeline. "He knew you would come," Roy said. "He wrote to me that he knew you would. He said you were stubborn enough and smart enough that if there was anything worth coming for, you would come for it." "He was an infuriating man," Hazel said, "but he was not wrong about me." "No," Roy said. "He was not." There was a moment where their horses' strides brought them close together, close enough that their knees almost touched, and neither of them moved apart. Autumn came in with color and purpose, and with it the cattle drive to market. It was a 3-day drive to the railhead at Roper Junction, and Hazel had asked to go. Roy had considered it for a day before agreeing, and she knew without being told that what he was considering was not her capability but her safety, which felt different from the kind of male protectiveness she had encountered before. It was not about doubting what she could do. It was about caring what happened to her. Those were different things, and she held the distinction carefully. The drive was, as all drives were, long and dusty, and punctuated by the specific chaos of 100 cattle being asked to go somewhere they had not decided to go on their own. Hazel rode drag, which was the least glamorous position and the dustiest, and she did it without complaint. Cal Dawson rode beside her for much of the first day, offering quiet instruction on how to read the cattle and predict which ones were likely to cause trouble, and she paid close attention. Roy rode point, which meant he was at the head of the herd, reading the ground ahead and setting the pace. She could see him from her position, a distant figure at the front of the moving mass of cattle, and she found that she spent more time watching him than she intended to. The second night, They camped on the open plain under a sky so full of stars it seemed almost deliberately excessive. Roy sat down beside her at the fire, close enough that their arms were touching, and they drank coffee and looked at the stars and said very little. And Hazel thought that this was the kind of quiet she had been looking for all her life without knowing it. Not the quiet of isolation or loneliness, but the quiet of being exactly where you were supposed to be with exactly the right person beside you. "What do you want?" Roy asked. He was looking at the stars. "From life," she asked. "From this, from here, from us." She thought about it seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I want to build something real," she said. "I want to look at this land in 10 years and know that my hands helped make it what it is. I want to be genuinely useful, not decorative or peripheral. I want to matter here." "You already matter here," he said. "I want it to keep being true," she said. "And I want," she paused, "I want what you had with Clara, the real thing. I don't want a practical arrangement that we've gotten comfortable in. I want the real thing." He turned and looked at her. The firelight was on his face and the stars were behind him, and she was suddenly aware that she had never in her life felt so completely present in a moment. "I want that too," he said. "I didn't think I would again, but I want it." "Then we should make sure it happens," she said. He reached over and took her hand again, and they sat like that beside the fire for a long time, the herd quiet around them, the stars turning slowly overhead. They sold the cattle well at Roper Junction, better than the previous year, and Roy attributed some of the better price to the timing, which Hazel had helped him recalculate based on the market patterns she had been tracking since she organized his accounts. He did not make a large thing of it, but on the ride back he told her the exact amount by which they had exceeded last year's sale and then said, quietly, "That's partly yours." "That's partly ours," she corrected. He smiled. It happened more easily now, the smiling, as if it had remembered how. The winter of 1878 came in cold but not with the devastating force of the previous one, and they were better prepared for it. Roy had followed Hazel's suggestion to buy supplemental hay from a surplus cellar she had located in October, which turned out to be a very good decision when the first hard freeze came in November, and the grass disappeared under 6 inches of snow. They spent long evenings inside together, and this was when she really came to know him, in the intimacy of winter evenings with the fire going and the world small and close outside the windows. She learned that he read, that he had a small collection of books: history, natural science, one novel that looked read many times, and that he had been largely self-educated past the age of 12 when his family had moved too far from any school. She lent him her copy of a book she had brought from Abilene, a natural history of North American birds, and he read it with the focused attention he brought to everything, and then they talked about it, and she found that he had things to say that surprised her with their insight and depth. He learned that she played chess. He had a board, battered but complete, that had belonged to his father. They started playing in the evenings, and it became something she looked forward to with an enthusiasm that was not entirely about the chess. She won the first game. He looked at the board for a long time afterward, analyzing how it had happened. He won the second game, but only just, and in a way that made her suspect he had been paying very close attention to the first game's lessons. By the third game they were evenly matched, which she found both satisfying and delightful. "You play like you work," he said one evening after a long, contested game. "You let me think I understand what you're doing, and then you've already done something else entirely." "Is that a complaint?" she asked. "It is the opposite of a complaint," he said. And the way he said it, with those dark eyes across the board, made her feel warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Christmas came, and with it a quiet celebration with Luther and the Dawson brothers at the main house. Hazel had cooked a proper meal, learned by years of watching her mother before her mother died and careful practice since, and the table was full and noisy and warm, and Roy sat at the head of it with an expression on his face that she recognized as happiness, real and present happiness, the kind that he probably had not let himself feel for some time. After everyone had gone back to the bunkhouse, Roy and Hazel sat alone at the table with the last of the coffee. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth and set it on the table between them. "I rode into town last week," he said. "When you were tallying the winter feed." She unwrapped it. It was a hair comb, delicately worked with a small sprig of carved flowers along its top edge. It was not expensive, but it was carefully chosen, the kind of thing you spend time selecting. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at him, and he was watching her with that look that she had come to understand meant he was feeling more than he was saying, which was how it almost always worked with Roy Collier. "It is beautiful," she said. "It's practical," he said, and there was a small joke in it, a private echo of something she had said in the early days, and she felt the warmth of being understood by someone, the particular warmth of an inside reference of a shared history, however short. She reached across the table and took his hand and turned it over and traced the lines on his palm with her finger, and when she looked up he was looking at her with something in his face that she thought might be the closest thing to awe she had ever seen directed at herself. "Roy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am in love with you," she said. "I want to say it plainly, since you are a man who appreciates plain speaking." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched his expression move through something complicated and arrive somewhere clear. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the day you sat across my kitchen table and told me you wanted the half with the river." He paused. "I did not understand that was what I was feeling at the time, but looking back, that was it." She laughed, soft and full. "You laughed at me." "I laughed because I had not expected you," he said. "I had expected a woman in trouble looking for a solution. Instead, I got you. And you walked in and you knew exactly what you wanted and you asked for the better half without a moment's hesitation. And I thought, here is someone worth knowing. I just didn't know then what that was going to mean." She stood up from her chair and came around the table to him, and he turned in his chair and she stood in front of him, and she put her hands on either side of his face, the way you hold something you are determined to keep. He put his hands on her waist and looked up at her with those dark creekwater eyes, and then he said her name, Hazel. In the low, careful way he said it when it meant the most, and she leaned down and kissed him properly, finally, the way she had been wanting to for longer than she had been willing to admit to herself. He kissed her back with all the feeling of a man who had been keeping things close for a very long time and had finally, safely, let them out. The spring of 1879 came, and Hazel stood at the kitchen window one morning in March and watched the land wake up from winter, the grass coming back green and tentative, the river running high and bright with snowmelt from the north, and she understood that she was happy in the complete and grounded way that she had not known before, the kind of happiness that is not about the absence of difficulty, but about the presence of the right life. She was also aware, with the particular awareness that women develop, that she was expecting a child. She told Roy on a Sunday morning, standing at that same window, and the way his face changed when she told him was something she kept in her memory as one of the most remarkable things she had ever seen. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still with things that mattered, and then he came to her and put his arms around her from behind, and they stood together at the window looking out at the land that was theirs, and he put his face against her hair and she felt him breathe. "A family," he said quietly. "A family," she agreed. "On our land," he said. "On our land," she said. "The half with the river." He laughed, and it was a good laugh, full and warm, and she turned in his arms and kissed him, and outside the window the Sweetwater Bend ran bright and full in the spring morning. The months that followed were good ones, busy with the ranch work and the preparations, and the particular joy of building a life that continues forward into new life. Hazel kept working throughout her pregnancy, adjusting what she could and finding ways to do from horseback, or from the house what she could not do on foot. Roy did not try to limit her. He helped, quietly and practically, in the ways that were needed, making certain tasks easier without taking them from her entirely, because he understood by now that her work was not incidental to her but essential. Deacon Price made one more attempt in May to revive his water rights claim. He hired a lawyer from Amarillo and sent a formal letter demanding arbitration. Hazel and Roy responded together, calmly and thoroughly, with the complete documentation that Hazel had been keeping current and organized for exactly this eventuality. The arbitrator, a circuit judge named Harrington who was known to be fair and thorough, reviewed the case and dismissed Price's claim within 2 weeks, noting that no written contract for the sale of water rights existed, that the deed was properly registered and superseded any alleged verbal agreement, and that the combined circumstances of the Collier claim left no legitimate ground for challenge. Price did not come back after that. She heard, several months later from Mrs. Dunlap in town, that he had gone north, that he had found a different opportunity in Colorado, that he was the kind of man who moved on when a situation stopped yielding returns. She felt no particular thing about this except relief, clean and complete. Their son was born in September of 1879. He arrived on a morning that had the quality of everything important, ordinary and extraordinary at once. Ordinary in the sense that births had happened every day since the beginning of the world. Extraordinary in the sense that this one was entirely and uniquely this one. Roy was there because Roy was not the kind of man who would be anywhere else, and Mrs. Dunlap had come to help, and the doctor from Harker City had arrived the previous evening to be safe, and when the baby arrived and announced himself with the specific authority of a person who intends to be noticed, Roy held him for the first time with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of the world has just been gently and irrevocably reorganized. "What shall we call him?" Hazel asked. Roy was looking at his son with the intensity of a man memorizing something. "James," he said. "James Henry Collier," he looked up at her. "Henry for your father, since this exists partly because of him." She felt something release in her chest. Her father, infuriating and imprecise, and finally generous in a sideways way that was entirely like him. "Yes," she said. "James Henry." Luther came to the house that evening and held the baby with the careful reverence of a man who would clearly do anything on earth for this child. And Cal and Pete Dawson stood in the doorway with their hats in their hands, and the expressions of very young men who have just been reminded that life is large and continuing. Time did what time does. It moved forward, and the land and the life on it deepened. By the fall of 1880, the ranch had grown. They had expanded the herd carefully, using the better water access on the east section to support the increased numbers. They had built a new barn on the east side, closer to the river pastures, and had expanded the ranch house itself, adding a proper sitting room and 2 additional rooms, with work done partly by hired hands from town and partly by Roy himself, who built the way he did everything, carefully and well. James Henry Collier grew into a child of enormous curiosity and considerable noise, who by the age of 2 was following Luther around the ranch with the absolute conviction of someone who belonged in exactly this place, and who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's decisive manner, and a personality entirely his own that delighted them both. Hazel had become, over the 2 years since her arrival in Coldwater Creek, something the local community recognized and respected. She had started, quietly and without making a project of it, keeping the accounts for 3 other small ranches in the area, whose owners were in the same situation Roy had been in, good at working land and bad at tracking numbers. She charged a fair rate and did it in the time she had, and the result was that 3 families had a better financial understanding of their own operations. 2 of them had avoided mistakes that might have cost them their land, and one of them, a widow named Eugenia Farrow, with a small cattle operation she had inherited from her husband, had been able to negotiate a better sale price for her herd because Hazel had helped her understand what her operation was actually worth. She also started a lending library out of the back room of the Coldwater Creek General Store, with books she sourced through a contact in Dallas and made available for borrowing to anyone who wanted them. It was a small thing, but it was hers, and she was proud of it with the particular pride of someone who has made something out of nothing. Roy watched all of this with a quality of attention that she had come to understand as one of his primary expressions of love, which was simply that he paid attention to everything she did, genuinely and without distraction. He never minimized what she was building or treated it as secondary to the ranch work. He asked about the books, about the families she was helping, and listened to what she told him with the same focus he gave to everything that mattered to him. One evening in the fall of 1880, sitting on the porch in the last of the autumn light with James asleep inside and the cattle quiet in the south pasture, Roy said, "Do you remember what you wanted? When we drove the cattle that first year," she thought back. "To build something real, to matter here." "Do you?" he asked. She considered the question seriously because he had asked it seriously. She looked at the land, her land, their land, the half with the river running silver and steady in the evening light, and she thought about the accounts she had reorganized, the families she had helped, the books on the shelf in the general store, the child sleeping in the back room, the man beside her. "Yes," she said, "I do." He reached over and took her hand the way he had started doing in Harker City and had not stopped since. He held it the way he held things that mattered, careful and certain. "Good," he said. The years of the early 1880s were years of building and settling, of the kind of daily and seasonal work that is the real texture of a life on the land. And Hazel had come to understand something she had not known before she came here, which was that this texture, demanding and unromantic in its particulars, was the very thing that made a life feel real and solid. There were hard days. There were seasons of scarcity and anxiety. A drought in the summer of 1881 that dried the south pastures and tested the water management they had worked so hard to establish. A year when cattle prices fell, and they had to make hard decisions about the herd numbers. There were small illnesses and large worries and the ordinary accumulation of difficulty that is part of any genuine life. Through all of it, they were each other's first and most trusted counsel. Roy told her things he had not told anyone since Clara, and before Clara had probably not told anyone at all. She told him things she had kept to herself for years, the particular loneliness of her years in Abilene, the complicated grief of her father's death, the fear she had carried on the first ride to his ranch that this would not work out, that she would arrive and find something not equal to the hope she was trying not to have. "Were you afraid?" he asked once about that first arrival. "Terrified," she said. "I was completely terrified." "You didn't show it," he said. "I have always found that showing it doesn't help," she said. "So I asked for the better half instead." He shook his head with a smile that she loved, that particular smile of his that was partly amusement and partly something warmer. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1882. They named her Clara after his first wife and the painter of the mountains that still hung beside the kitchen door. Roy had asked if Hazel would mind, and she had said no. She would not mind at all, that it was right, that Clara was part of this place, and deserved to be named into the next generation of it. She said it and she meant it completely, because she had come to understand that the love Roy had for his first wife was not a threat to what he had now, but a testament to it. Evidence that he was a man capable of real and lasting love. Clara Collier arrived with considerably less ceremony than James had, faster and more certain, as if she had decided on the matter already and was simply executing a plan. She had her mother's green eyes and her mother's determined expression and Roy's calm, and she slept through everything, which James absolutely did not. And the contrast between them made everyone who spent time at the Collier Ranch feel that the universe had a sense of humor. James, who was 2.5 when his sister arrived, regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and proprietary pride that shifted gradually, over the months that followed, toward something that looked a great deal like devotion. He appointed himself her protector with the full conviction of a small boy who has decided this is his job, and neither Roy nor Hazel discouraged it. Luther came to see the baby on the day of her arrival, as he had come to see James, and he held her with the same careful reverence. And this time he did not go back to the bunkhouse right away. He sat in the kitchen for a long while, drinking coffee and talking with Roy about ordinary things while Hazel rested in the other room, and she could hear their voices through the wall, low and easy, the voices of two men who had been through difficult things together and had come out the other side. There was an evening, in the summer of 1882, that Hazel thought about many times afterward. She had put the children to bed, James in his room and Clara in the cradle in the corner of the main room, and she came out onto the porch to find Roy sitting there looking at the land in the last of the daylight. The Sweetwater Bend was visible from the porch, a glinting line through the east pasture, silver and steady. She sat down beside him and he put his arm around her, naturally and without ceremony, and she leaned into him. "Do you know what day it is?" he asked. She thought. "For years," she said, "since I rode up that track." "For years," he agreed. She thought about the woman who had ridden up that track alone, frightened under the surface, holding her dignity in both hands, asking for the better half because it was the only power she had. "I asked for the half with the river," she said. "You did," he said. "Best thing anyone ever asked me." "You laughed," she said. "I didn't expect that." "I hadn't laughed in a long time," he said. "I'd forgotten I was capable of it." He paused. "And then you asked for the better half of my land with the absolute certainty of someone who expected to get it, and I thought this woman is going to change everything." "Was I right?" she asked. "About the half with the river being better?" "You were absolutely right," he said, "and you have never let me forget it." "I never will," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and between them, visible through the open door, was the kitchen where they had first sat across a table from each other with a map and a practical arrangement, and absolutely no idea what was about to happen. And beyond the window, the east pasture, and beyond that the river, running silver and clear in the evening light, the river she had asked for and received, the river that ran through everything they had built. He tightened his arm around her, and she put her hand over his, and they sat like that while the light faded and the stars came out one by one over the Texas plain. The years continued. Roy turned 36 and then 37, and the lines around his eyes deepened in the way that happens to people who spend their lives outside and squinting at distances, and she thought it suited him. She turned 30 and then 31, and she had the particular quality of a woman who has found her work in her life and inhabited them fully, which gave her a kind of settledness that was different from youth and better. They hired 2 additional hands as the ranch operation expanded, a young man named Domingo Reyes, who had come north from the South Texas country, and was the best horseman any of them had seen, and an older man named Thomas Bright, who had once run his own small spread, and had lost it to bad weather and worse luck, and brought with him the valuable combination of skills and humility. Hazel made a point of ensuring both men were paid properly and treated with respect, which Roy had been doing already but appreciated her making explicit. She was aware, living in this part of Texas in these years, of the complexities and injustices that surrounded them. The displacement of the Comanche people, whose land this had been before the settlement that put up fences and built ranches, had happened within recent memory. The Red River War of 1874, just 4 years before her arrival, had forcibly moved the last free-ranging Comanche bands onto reservations, and she had met, in the early years, men who had participated in that campaign who spoke of it without apparent reflection. She did not speak without reflection. She thought about the land she had claimed, the river she had asked for, and she understood that the question of what constituted legitimate ownership was older and more complicated than any deed, however well registered. She spoke about this to Roy once quietly, and he was quiet for a long time before he answered. "I know it," he said. "My father knew it too. He used to say that the land doesn't belong to anyone, that we are at best its stewards and at worst its thieves, and the honest man's job is to be closer to the first than the second." "That's a good way to think about it," Hazel said. "It doesn't fix what was done," Roy said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They were quiet together with that, the way you have to be quiet with things that are true and painful, and that you cannot individually solve, but that you refuse to simply not see. By the fall of 1883, the Collier Ranch was one of the better established operations in the county. The herd was healthy, the land was well managed, the accounts were in better order than they had ever been, and the family that lived on it had the quality of a life that had been genuinely built rather than inherited or stumbled into. Hazel had a third set of books she was consulting on, a young couple named Walters who had arrived the previous spring with energy and optimism, and absolutely no financial system. And the lending library had expanded to the point where she was thinking about whether it might be possible in the next few years to have a proper building for it. James was 4 and absolutely himself, which meant that he was in everything and after everything and the subject of various negotiations with Luther, who had essentially become a third grandparent to both children in the way that happened naturally on working ranches where people lived and worked together for years. Clara was 2 and still calm and determined, and she had recently decided that horses were specifically her domain, which Roy found deeply amusing since he had been the same way at her age, and his father had said something similar about him. One evening in October, with the leaves of the cottonwoods in the river valley gone gold and dropping, Roy and Hazel rode out to the river together in the late afternoon, just the two of them, which they did when they could, which was not as often as they would have liked and more often than some people managed. They stopped at the bend where the river slowed and deepened, where the water was clear over smooth stones and the cottonwoods came down to the bank, and the whole thing had a quality of particular rightness, as if the land had saved this spot to show what it was capable of at its best. Roy got down from his horse and helped her down, the way he always did, and they stood at the river's edge and looked at the water. "Mine," Hazel said, looking at the river. She said it in the tone she had used to say such things since the beginning, the tone that was equal parts humor and genuine possession. "Ours," Roy said, in the tone he had developed in response, which acknowledged the original terms while indicating that everything had long since exceeded them. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the river, with the expression he had when he was thinking about something important. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the arrangement we made at the beginning." "The practical arrangement," she said. "Yes, the practical arrangement." He turned to her. "I have been thinking that I should formally tell you that the practical arrangement, the one where I offered you half my land in exchange for a legal and strategic partnership, has been entirely superseded by the actual arrangement, which is something that I would not have known how to ask for, and that I have no adequate words for, and that I intend to spend the rest of my life being grateful for." She looked at him steadily. "Roy Collier," she said, "that is the most words I have ever heard you say in sequence about your feelings." "I have been preparing it," he admitted. She laughed full and warm, and he smiled in that complete way that still, 5 years later, rearranged something in her chest. "It was a very good speech," she said. "Thank you," he said. "I meant every word." "I know you did," she said. "That is what made it good." She took both his hands and held them, standing at the edge of their river on their land, in the afternoon light of an October that smelled like dried grass and coming cold, and the particular sweetness of a life that had become, through work and choice and improbable good fortune, exactly what she had not known she was looking for. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said, the way he said the things that mattered most, simply and without decoration. They stood there for a while, the horses cropping grass behind them, the river running over its smooth stones, the gold leaves coming down one by one in the afternoon air. Then they rode home, to the ranch house with the painting of mountains on the wall, to the children who were waiting, to the table where they had first sat across from each other with a map and a proposal and no idea yet what the land would give them, which turned out to be everything worth having, a home built by both their hands, a life that fit the people living it, and the river, their river, running clear and constant through the land they had claimed together and made into something that would last. The winter of 1883 came in gentle, as if the land itself had decided that this particular family had earned a mild season, and they passed it in the warmth of the house with the fire going, and the children underfoot, and Luther coming to supper on Sundays, and the chess board on the table, and the books on the shelf, and all the ordinary, extraordinary texture of a life that had found its shape. And if you had ridden up that track in the early evenings, past the fence posts with the C brand burned into every third one, past the corrals and the barns and the bunkhouse with its lamplight, and looked through the kitchen window of the main house, you would have seen them there, Roy and Hazel Collier, the man who had offered half his land, and the woman who had asked for the better half, sitting at the table they had sat at from the first, two people who had made a practical arrangement and found, in the making of it, something far better than either had known how to ask for. The river ran on the east side, clear and full, through the land that was theirs, the land they had protected and worked and loved, the land their children would one day know every inch of, the land that had been the beginning of everything and was now simply home.